Hello and welcome to Storical. I am your host, Peter Roberts. At Storical, we think your stories are historical. History is the story of you, and they deserve to be recorded and shared. Storical is the place you come to for advice on how to capture life story, tools to use, and how to complete your project. Listen to experts, memoir writers, and product reviews. Let's inspire you to start. Hello, and thank you for joining me today for episode 15 of Storical. I hope you are getting value out of our episodes and guess they have brought a lot of insight to recording personal history. And today's guest is no different. Ellie Kahn has been working as a life story professional since 1988 in the Los Angeles area, and she brings a wealth of knowledge to our discussion today. Ellie has always been interested in life story. Listen as she describes her interests, especially in helping people at the end of their life reflect and talk about their experiences. Ellie tells us her process, and lastly, she tells us her advice. Let's get started. Ellie, thank you for being on Storical today.
I'm glad to be here.
Ellie, can you tell me your job title?
I call myself an oral historian because that was my training 25 years ago.
How did you get into oral history?
I was a writer at the time. I had been doing freelance writing, and I found myself very drawn to older people. And in fact, my then husband used to comment about how I was constantly picking up old people in the park. And I had written an article about an elderly woman in New England where my mother and I were traveling to go cross country skiing. And I started thinking about whether I could have my writing career focus around the stories of older people. One of my friends said to me one day, "Have you heard about the field of oral history?" And I had not. So I started doing some research and found my mentor, Gary Shumway, who taught at an oral history program at Cal State Fullerton here in Los Angeles. He really became my guide to starting my career. He also was someone who produced the books of his own oral histories. He's a Mormon and was going to Utah for a very big oral history program. So he not only was my mentor, but he started me on publishing books for my clients.
Wow. So tell me what sort of work you do today.
I'm primarily hired by families who recognize how valuable the stories are of their older members, or I'm hired by people who want to make sure that they leave their stories for their grandchildren and future generations. In addition, I'm also occasionally hired by organizations or communities to produce an oral history project. Like Paramount Studios had me interview two people who had been involved with the studios for many decades. Some years ago, I was hired by the Jewish Historical Society to create an oral history of the Jewish neighborhood that was in East Los Angeles between World Wars I and II. And that became a documentary film when we selected the people from the project to be in the film. But mostly I'm doing family histories. Some of the people that I interview are not old or elderly, but they're younger people who are facing the end of their life because of a terminal illness.
Mm-hmm.
Their family realizes that they want to make sure that that person's stories are saved. Or in the example of a 50-year-old man who found out that he had cancer, he wanted to make sure his 5-year-old daughter knew about his life and what his values were. So he wanted to have those recorded.
That must be incredibly sad for people to reminisce about their life like that.
Oh, no, I don't find it that way. I find that it's very cathartic and meaningful and usually fun to be looking back at one's life, unless it's been a very traumatic life.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is very moving for them to talk about what it's like facing a serious illness and facing saying goodbye and what they will miss in their life. And I think probably because I'm a therapist, I'm completely comfortable having those conversations with them. And really, I invite those conversations because I think a lot of people haven't had a chance to really talk openly about the fact that they're dying.
Right. Is that because they're too scared to talk about it or because they don't have anyone to talk to?
Well, I think they're protecting their family and their family's protecting them. So, unfortunately, it's not a very common thing. Some families even hide from a relative that they know that they have a terminal illness, or the person who has a terminal illness doesn't tell his family. And my feeling about it is that it's a tremendous loss for everyone because they are left with not being able to share what they're going through during a very difficult time in their lives. So I find that it's a big relief when I ask them to talk about it, and frequently have their family members present.
Mm-hmm. So tell me the process you go through talking with your clients.
In general, you mean?
Well, let's talk about your clients who are dying. Is it different to those who are not dying?
No, I can't really say that it is, except for the point where I say, okay, let's talk about your diagnosis and how you're dealing with that and what your thoughts are about what's next. But I talk to most people about how they feel about aging, what their thoughts are about what happens after they die. So when someone actually has a diagnosis, that's the additional topic is how are you handling that? How are you and your family facing that? But otherwise, it's really the same interview. Let's start talking about your family's background. They want the same stories recorded that anyone else does. They feel more of an urgency about it.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it's really too bad that it takes that for people to feel the urgency because so many people end up not recording their stories and their stories go with them to the grave, no matter what age they are. So I like to encourage people to view recording their stories with some urgency because too many people regret that they didn't do it.
Mm. Yes, I guess there's not too many people who'd regret actually recording their life story.
No, that's an interesting point. I have not heard anyone, in all these years and hundreds of interviews, I can't think of anyone except one family that had me interview their mother. I thought she was telling great stories and fascinating things about her family history and then some things about her two sons. And when they received the video, they discovered how much dementia she actually had, and they were unhappy because she really was confused and didn't talk about things with accuracy. But that's the only time I've actually had someone say, oh dear, maybe we shouldn't have done this.
Is accuracy important in life story?
I have had lots of conversations, including with my original mentor and with historians who are not oral historians. And there is a very big difference between wanting someone's personal view of their life and their personal recollections and having things be accurate from an objective historical perspective. It might be that some people are frustrated if a relative remembered the name of an ancestor incorrectly or they distorted something that they were recalling, but I don't find that that's a problem. It really is not the goal of most people who want an oral history done to have it be a historical document. They want it to be something that is that person's personal, subjective, possibly inaccurate, but fascinating because it's their memories recording.
How do you record people's stories? Is it an audio or video means by which you do that?
I use both. The first project I ever did was my ex-husband's grandmother, and we videotaped her on the same video camera that we were using for our new baby. Neither of us knew what the heck we were doing, but we just followed her around and her old place where she and her husband had lived when they first got married. And then we edited in the camera, and I have advanced from that point to using either professional videographers to shoot the video if a client's budget can include that, or I use my own video camera. Otherwise, I use a digital audio recorder.
Who are your clients, Ellie?
They are mostly in Los Angeles, although I have been flown to New York and Florida and Baltimore and Chicago and Cleveland for projects. They mostly are local people. I would say that they are people who have strong family connections. I don't think that anyone who has horrible trauma from their childhood with their parents or people who are alienated from their children hire me. I would say that I'm hired by people who care about their family, they care about their parents or their grandparents or their children or their grandchildren, and they realize that these stories will be lost if they aren't recorded, and they recognize the value in saving those stories. A good part of my clientele are Jewish people. And I think that's because I started a long time ago interviewing Holocaust survivors. When Spielberg started the project for interviewing, I think his aim was 60,000 Holocaust survivors around the world. They needed people who already were trained oral historians. So I did some interviews for them when they first started. And I think that because a lot of my work comes from referrals, people refer me within their temple or within their family. I have also done presentations in temples and senior centers. I can't say that it's a bigger value for Jewish people to save their stories. I'm sure that that's not true.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're in that space, you get to be known as that person, don't you?
Yes, and I also think because the oral history project that I created in 1990 was for the Jewish Historical Society, and it was about the Jewish neighborhood that was in East Los Angeles, I became known from that documentary film, which aired for many years on the local PBS station.
Right.
People have written articles about me in the Los Angeles Times, but also in the Jewish Journal here.
So, do you ever meet someone who says, "Oh, but my life wasn't that interesting. I don't have stories to tell"?
Yes. I think it's probably more common that people don't assume that their stories are either poignant or entertaining. What I tell them is they are an extraordinary person to their family, even if they're an ordinary person in their own minds. And they don't have to have lived through some kind of horrific life experiences or had some kind of major invention or a celebrity, even though I have interviewed those types of people. But wouldn't we all like to have our great grandparents' memoirs? It's, their history is what their descendants will want to know about, even if it has to do with the times they lived in, how they got through the Depression, or whether they served in one of the wars, or how their values were learned and what means something to them now and what has had meaning to them over their lifetime. I don't think that those are questions that require someone to be entertaining. And people really discover that as soon as we get started.
People would be recalling their ordinary life, their challenges, their positive moments.
Yes, I start with people's ancestors and move up generation by generation, usually ask about their grandparents, and we just move through the generations, starting with their own life. I'm asking them to recall memories. I see my job as finding different ways to ask the same question sometimes. Very often they knew more than they thought they knew. Now, my job is to guide them through these different generations in their own life and times, as well as to ask questions in different ways or follow-up questions to help them recall the details and the feelings and of their experiences.
So, do you find people are willing to talk about the challenges that they have in their life?
Yes, I would say usually that is the case. I think people agree to be part of this process because they want to talk about how they've moved through their life. And I think it's a relief for many people to talk about how they've handled challenges. And again, maybe because my background is in psychotherapy, I am not hesitant to ask them things that might trigger emotional responses. Most people seem to feel okay with that. If they cry, they cry. If they feel moved in some way, that's fine. I think it's a relief for people to be able to talk about whatever they've gone through, including their challenges.
How do you help people remember the details of their life when you don't know them? Do you give them prompts or help them focus on certain aspects?
Well, I ask hundreds of questions and follow up questions. The questions I ask are geared towards asking them to recall certain events or certain times in their life. What are your earliest childhood memories, for instance? I don't know anything about their childhood, but asking them that question, they have a chance to think back. I also might ask them to visualize their home that they lived in when they were a child, and that visualization might help them recall scenes and relationships or things that happened in their childhood. All I have to go by is the questions that I ask them, and then their answers lead me to my next question and my next question.
Right. How long do projects normally take?
My interviews over the years have lasted anywhere from 3 to 22 hours.
In different sessions?
Oh, yes. Some people have more stamina than others. Someone who says I can probably only sit for a few hours once they get going might talk for 5 or 6 or 8 hours. And the number of sessions really depends on how somebody recalls details and how they respond to the questions. If I ask a question and the person answers with a very brief response, and I ask them again in a different way, and it still results in a brief response, then their interview will be shorter than someone who has a lot to say about whatever question I asked. I certainly find that more people have a lot to say than have very little to say. In part, I think because it's such a rare experience for someone to have a conversation with someone who is expressly there to listen to them.
So you have an effect on that person just by being there?
I think so, yes. Again, it's really rare for someone to know that the purpose of the conversation is just for them to be listened to and acknowledged and heard. If they have family who love them, they still are not sitting for hours at a time being the focus of the conversation. In fact, I remember with my own grandmother, as soon as I said, "Hi, Grandma, how are you?" her response was, "I'm fine, let's talk about you." I just don't think that a lot of family members sit down and talk for hours with anyone, even if they love them. And it's one reason that I created a project a long time ago as part of a nonprofit that I founded that was geared towards teaching students in middle and high school classes to interview their grandparents, because I found that in all of my interviews, there's an intimacy that happens between that person and myself simply because we're having these in-depth conversations. And it occurred to me that this might be a nice way to bring together people in the same family who might not ordinarily have those kind of conversations. So I developed a curriculum in 1995 to teach in both history and English classes, as it happened. The students learned how to actually listen and how to ask questions so that they were able to have that kind of meaningful conversation with their grandparents. If they didn't have grandparents still living, they interviewed their parents.
Do you still have the foundation?
Yes, I do. It's called Living Legacies Historical Foundation, but the curriculum is tellmeyourstories.org. The curriculum is still there, and people around the world have gone to the website and downloaded the information and the forms. I think a lot of projects have been developed over the years that have kids interview family members, and I think it's wonderful.
I bet. I don't think I've heard of resources like that out there.
I know elementary school kids have been asked at some of the schools I know of in Los Angeles to do a little interview with their grandparents. And I think it's a great start. These were 2-hour interviews, and the students came up with the questions. We brainstormed about the questions. And then they sat down with the family member. I would say consistently, the response was, I had no idea that my grandmother went through that. I had no idea that my father had such a hard time coming to America. One of the students called his grandmother in Korea to interview her. I loved it, and I loved the teaching.
Mm.
One of the programs at one of the schools, they then sent students to a local nursing home to interview residents at the nursing home who were not their relatives, but it was a community service project. It's a great way to bring people together.
It is. Now, once you've put together this recording, the video, you just do video and audio, right?
I do videos and make books. The recordings are audio, but the end product is a book.
So, who reads the memoirs of your clients?
They're made for, not for the public, they're made for the family.
So, they're read by family members and friends?
Yes. In fact, the one exception is a client who really wrote a love story about her life with her husband, who had passed away 2 years before I interviewed her. The book includes hundreds of their love letters to each other. She's 83, and she teaches classes in lip reading and brain aerobics to 200 students a week.
Oh, wow.
And she tells stories about herself and her life. So I guess some of the stories are about her husband. And once the book was made, she has ended up ordering 200 of them because all of her students wanted a copy of the book. That is the exception. It is mostly the family that gets the books. I've also done temple histories, so members of the congregation might buy the book. The videos are also mostly for families, although when I've done a video about the history of a school, then the video is used in a fundraising situation. But it's really 85% for the family.
And how do the family react? Are your clients surprised at the family's reaction to their memoirs?
I can give you one example. A woman hired me to interview her mother and father in law as a surprise to her husband, their son. They were Holocaust survivors. It was a book, and he called me after he was given the book and said that he sat up all night crying because there was so much that he had never known about his parents' experiences during the Holocaust. I would say that without exception, people are surprised at things they didn't know about their parents' lives or their challenges or how they got through different periods of their life or how they got into trouble as children or even things about how their parents met each other that just haven't come up in their family conversations. So I would say generally the response is there was so much we didn't know about their lives. The people who are telling the stories are, I would say, thrilled that their children and grandchildren are happy to have the project. It means a lot to them to know that their memories and their recollections are important to their family.
Mm. And how do your clients themselves react when they get their own memoir in a book form and you give it to them, or they see themselves on video?
I would say usually they're pleased. Occasionally, I will go back to that first project that we did with my ex-husband's grandmother. This is just humorous. We did a fine job of recording her, and she told all these great stories, and we showed it to the family at Christmas, the video. And afterwards, she took us aside and she said, "It's a wonderful video, but could you remove me?" And it was because she was such a vain person. She didn't really like the way she looked. Depending on their value system, in a video, someone might think that they don't look as good as they hoped they would, or that they didn't sound as entertaining as they might have looked. But that is really rare. I would say generally people are thrilled because they watch the video usually with their family. One recent project was a tribute. The daughter hired me specifically to make a video of her father's life because he was not well. And he got a chance to see the video before he died, and he was delighted. And he was delighted that his friends and family who were there watching it with him were entertained and interested and surprised. And then it was shown at his memorial, which was very meaningful. But he loved it, and he loved the attention that he got during the process and with the final video. People who receive the book are, I think, very happy that it all got put together. They love how the photos illustrate their stories, and they're surprised. Wow, I didn't expect this to look like a real book or something like that. Usually, everyone's quite happy with it. And many people give the book as a gift to their grandchildren. They're so happy. They have a pile of books and they hand them out at a family gathering, or they give it to a grandchild for high school graduation. They're really pleased that they have this legacy to pass on to the family.
Mm. Do you find that through reflection and through talking about their stories that people have an opportunity to reflect on events that didn't make sense at the time, or they are able to process the event a little bit better?
Yes, I think so. I think that the fact that I'm asking many questions and delving into a situation possibly more deeply than the person has thought about it for years does end up with them being intrigued that some of the thoughts and memories and details have come up. It's really about having a chance to review one's life in a way that people just don't do. So everything that we're talking about gives them a chance to notice more of the emotions that are connected with that, and to think in a different way than most people do about relationships. If I'm asking someone to tell me about their mother, what was she like? What are their memories of her? What was their relationship like with her? During that conversation, people often say, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, or hadn't really realized until you asked that question how that really impacted me. It's not therapy at all, but it's a healing process for people to be able to review and recall and examine different aspects of their life and their relationships and their experiences.
Some people never get started, though, on recording their life history. What kind of advice would you give someone who's been considering it, but they haven't yet started?
Well, if they're considering it for themselves, I would say don't wait while your memories are sharp and you can recall things about your life. It's really a gift to your family. It deprives them if you don't leave your stories for them. It deprives future generations from knowing about their ancestors, those who came before them, what the family's values were. If children are thinking about having their parents do this, but they're hesitating, I think they need to recognize what an acknowledgement it is of the person to be told that their stories and memories have tremendous value to the family.
Mm.
And I also think people are sometimes in denial about the fact that an older parent or relative is not going to be around forever. I find that frequently people say, we don't want my mother to think that because we're doing this, we think she's going to die soon. And that's a very interesting reason not to do it. I think it's a sad reason not to do it. And it really points to people's discomfort with their own or their parents' mortality.
Mm.
I try to instill a sense of urgency. Whether people hire me or not, I try to instill in them a sense of urgency about how often I hear regret when people haven't done this.
Mm. Yes, too often I've heard people say, well, I remember my mother telling me a story, but I've forgotten what she said now, and I wish I'd taken more notice.
That is so common. And how full of regret I am that I never thought to interview my own grandparents. I did interview my parents when I started doing this. They were both very clear in terms of their memories. I might not have done it if I wasn't having them be my guinea pig.
Mm.
But I wish I had thought to do it with my grandparents. I have one audio recording of my grandfather when he was in his 80s. I was in high school, but we just loved his stories. My father and I decided to sit down and record some of them. And it's just amazing to hear his voice. He's been dead since 1969. And to hear his voice is just very touching and fun.
Ellie, where is your business located and what geographical locations do you cover?
I'm in Los Angeles.
Tell us how the audience can connect with you after the show. Do you have a website?
Oh, I do have a website, Living Legacies, familyhistories.com.
I think we've covered everything. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and I do like your advice. People do need to be proactive, I think.
Yeah, the only thing I want to really make a big point about is what a healing process it is. It's not therapy, but it's really therapeutic for people to have a chance in the last chapter of their life to get to reminisce with someone who is specifically there to listen to that and to acknowledge them and to be with them on that journey. It's just a fabulous process for anyone to have. And the people that I've interviewed who are only in their 30s or 40s or 50s because of an illness, it's also tremendously healing. They may not have as many decades of stories, but they still have a lifetime of experiences. They know that they're able to leave those stories for their family.
Ellie, thank you so much for being on Storical today.
That was fun. Thank you for asking me to do this.
Thank you for joining me in another episode of Storical. Feel free to let me know how you like Storical, either on iTunes or where you get your podcasts. Or you can email me, Peter, P-E-T-A, at storical, STORYICAL.com. Never miss an episode by joining us at our website, storical.com. May Storical inspire you to story the historical, because it's never too soon to get started, but often it can be too late.